we've learned one thing from the Chauvin trial. It's that this whole due process thing is overrated. Or, at least that's what those in power would have us believe. Because due process protects minorities from centralized bases of power. And despite the concerted efforts to redefine language, minorities does not just mean racial minorities. And when the power in media, in technology, in the White House, and in Congress are all on the same side, anyone with opposing views better watch the fuck out. Today, we'll be looking at this article, penned by the rag owned by the richest or second richest man on the planet, depending on the day of the week, and see how it pushes for persons accused of non-violent crimes to be held without bail, because they are on the wrong side of the aisle. Now, first thing to note is this doesn't purport to be an opinion piece. It's framed very much as, here's the facts, sir, make of them what you will. Just a straightforward factual reporting piece. But as we're about to see, it is anything but objective. Very much manipulative, very much pushing an agenda. So first thing we'll start out with is one of the name manipulation tactics on the 5 sheet, poison the well. In this very first paragraph, handing a victory to U.S. prosecutors. So that language subconsciously tells the reader that this event they're describing is a victory. And U.S. prosecutors. Most people in this audience who are reading this are going to like the U.S. So it's a victory for the U.S. Yay! That could just as easily be described, with the same amount of factuality, be described as handing a loss to civil rights advocates. But that's just the opposite framing. That's not the way they want to present this story. They do not want to focus on the due process side of this. They do not want to focus on the infringement of constitutional liberties. They want to focus on the exact opposite. They want to minimize that and push through this narrative that as long as we get the guys we disagree with behind bars, that's what matters. All the technicalities in the Constitution, to hell with them. So that's the very first thing, is poisoning the well right at the beginning, painting this as a victory. Right. Another manipulative tactic they use here, the straw man feigning ignorance. So they say down here that the appeals court raised the bar by, quote, requiring judges to specify why those detained pose a risk of dangerousness or if they aided, conspired with, planned, or coordinated such actions. Now, that's a unique way of framing it. What they're leaving out is that prosecutors are able to choose where to file the case. They're allowed to venue shop, which means they choose what judge to file the charges against. The defendants just have to defend themselves against the charges in front of whatever judges the prosecutors choose. So the judge is most likely one very favorable to the prosecution side of the case. And in this scenario, he was willing to hold these defendants without bail in some very unusual circumstances. Go above and beyond just to hold these guys because it suited, because the events of January 6th, the riots on that day were so crazy, whatever, that we're just gonna keep them locked up indefinitely until the feds make up their mind about what to do with these guys. Rule of law, all that regular stuff, we're just going to throw it out the window and just keep these guys locked up until the federales make up their mind, decide what kind of charges to bring, yada yada. And then they're saying the appeals court, when they pushed back on that and said, whoa, if you're gonna hold these guys, if you're gonna refuse bail for these guys, you have to, like, explain why. You have to say that it would actually be, like, dangerous or something. Or, flight risk, or, go through the normal procedures for why you would refuse bail to someone. So they're describing that here as raising the bar. It's very much a dishonest framing of that argument by the appellate court. Another little one here. The defense, let's switch up the order here. So another manipulative tactic they used was intentionally confusing. This article was very long, and it seemed intended to get the viewers, or, the reader's eyes to glaze over. You're just reading, there's this thing, that thing, this thing. Most lay readers are not going to follow every beat of that story and critically assess. They're just going to get to the point where, okay, yeah, whatever. These guys are bad, sure, lock them up. That seemed like what they were trying to do here. And another thing it lets them do is bury the parts of the story, the facts that they feel obligated to include, but they don't want the readers to actually see. So, whatever the very last thing you put into a story, readers are usually going to sort of wake up and be like, oh, that's the end, what's the button? They'll pay attention like the last sentence, the last paragraph, but the second to last thing is where you can bury stuff. So what they put in the second to last thing is the defense's argument. They spend 9 pages explaining all these tenuous arguments by the prosecution. And then they summarize the defense's whole argument right at the end there, in that little burial plot. And so that seemed like a manipulative tactic where they were hiding the defense's argument. But that ties in to the straw man, because part of the defense's argument was that the planning and coordination these guys were doing was not to go and start attacking members of Congress or committing violent acts against Capitol Police. It was to defend themselves against violent counter-protesters, as the Proud Boys have done time and time again. That's been their track record. So when they were buying tactical vests, when they were buying mace, when they were communicating, through Telegram about that type of stuff, the defense's argument is that was not to stage an offensive attack. That was because they expected violent counter-protesters, Antifa types, and they wanted to be prepared to defend themselves. So, if that is, once you're aware of that argument, which again doesn't get brought up until the very end of the article, then it makes a lot of the factual bases that the prosecution is arguing should be grounds for why these guys are held indefinitely in jail without bail. It makes those allegations a lot weaker. That the way the prosecution was painting it was that these guys, clearly this is evidence of them planning this coup d'etat. Look, they're communicating, they're coordinating the purchase of tactical vests. What else could that be except a plan to attack police officers or to commit all these acts of violence? And obviously the rebuttal is, well, unless they're planning to defend themselves against counter-protesters. But they don't even bring up that argument until the very end, and at nowhere in the article do they connect those dots. Nowhere in the article do they say, well, the reason the defense would argue that they took all those actions was to defend themselves from counter-protesters. So that is very much a straw man, that they lay out the prosecution side without even acknowledging the defense's side of the argument. Maybe more of a feigning ignorance. They're just pretending that the defense's side of the argument doesn't exist. Alright. What else do we got here? A lot of manipulative tactics. Probably not going to go through every one of these. Really quick, under Poison the Well, they mentioned Trump's baseless claim about the 2020 election. And I'm not going to go out there and say there's anything improper about that 2020 election. And not just because of YouTube censorship rules, but, for other reasons. I will say that Time magazine put out an article detailing many bases that the election was fortified against Trump. So some people would argue that makes the claim not entirely baseless, but it's not an argument I'm going to make for reasons completely unrelated to censorship by tech oligarchs. Alright. Any other... Yeah, alright. The last manipulative tactic I'll touch on here is the undue emotion. They keep talking about these other people, like other unnamed defendants, who are not the two guys they're talking about in this article. Right? This is about two guys being denied bail and what a huge victory that is for the justice system. But those guys don't have very juicy stories. So they keep talking about these other guys that were tied up in the Capitol riots who had, some text messages or whatever, some telegram things that were a little bit, sounded a little bit more, entertaining or, a little bit more salacious. Not even salacious, but whatever. It made better fodder for their article. So they keep mentioning these other people that were not related to the subject matter of the story, just because that gave them something that was more fiery, let you, gin up the emotions a little bit better. So that was clearly manipulative tactic, bringing in those unrelated facts strictly to amp up the emotionality of the story. All told, the main problem with this story was what they didn't talk about, which was the tension between what these prosecutors are trying to do and the Constitution of the United States. The violations of due process. How these people are being held. First of all, what they're even being accused of, they're probably being way overcharged for, whatever. We can get into the details there. Or we don't need to get into those details today, but they're probably being overcharged they were planning on a peaceful protest. There's no real evidence that they were planning on committing acts of violence, but that's basically what they're being charged with. But the fact that they're being held without bail seems totally unjustifiable, and maybe there's an argument on the other side, and that is what this article is entirely devoted to, is laying out that argument on the other side. But they don't even once mention the constitutional question. They don't even once mention how civil libertarians are upset about what's going on here. They just pretend that is not part of the question. They act like it's a question of, to what extent are the prosecutors able to get past these technical hurdles to put these no-goodniks behind bars? It's like those technical hurdles are the United States Constitution. So, I was thinking about Blackstone's formulation, and I believe it's as true today as it was when it was written, that it's better 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent person suffer. And when I was preparing for this, I looked at the Wikipedia page, and it left me with this little gem. The message that government and courts must err on the side of bringing in verdicts of innocent has remained constant. Citation needed. I'm afraid that is telling of our times.